And with that lovely musical introduction, welcome to the Jeff Bushman Experience. And this is kind of take two. We did a full first video and nothing came out. So here we are again. In the West, specifically in Arizona, it is currently just before 5 p.m. on Sunday, May 31st, 2015. Tomorrow is the beginning of June, so happy June 1st. Today on the Experience, we're going to talk about, on the Experience, I'm beginning to sound like I'm the Factor, God forbid. Anyway, today on the show, we're going to be talking about Bernie in Manchester, sense in Lincoln, and if we have time, we'll be discussing This Week in History. And the first thing we're going to be discussing in a second is why the bad fourth quarter in the United States economy is probably a good thing for the economy generally. Let me talk to you about logistics first. If you have not watched the program before, where have you been? If you've not watched the program before, welcome. And the way we do this is we do it in usually two separate videos. The first one runs about 25 minutes. The second one runs no longer than 25 minutes. We have yet to do a third one, but it's conceivable that could happen today, or more correctly, more logically, next week. So if you are, this is the first one, so if you're watching this and we run out of time, you'll be invited to access the second one as well. If you are watching this in some other medium other than on YouTube, we do the show, and you can find our past videos at youtube.com and just look up my name, which is Jeff Bushman, or you can look up Jeff Bushman Experience, and it'll get you right there. Likewise, you can just Google it, Jeff Bushman Experience. It doesn't all have to be one word, and that would be crazy, but if you do that, will be the first thing that comes up, the only thing that comes up. If you just look up my name, we're probably at the beginning of the second page. But in any event, welcome to the show, and if you enjoy it, please tell a friend to join us. Also, you can follow us on Twitter. First, you can subscribe, I should add. Below my face, there should be something, if you're watching on YouTube, that says subscribe. By doing that, you can be notified by YouTube. I'll never have your email address. YouTube will notify you when another show appears. We generally do the show weekly. There's probably a joke there, but leaving that aside, we do the show every week, with rare exception, like the last two. So you can watch us anytime you wish, but each new show comes up Sunday night. Also, in terms of logistics, next week on the 7th of June, we'll be doing a program with a friend of mine, Rick Penn. If you're watching this and you know Rick, you can watch me and listen to Rick next week. And if you don't, then you can meet him through his audio presentation next week. We'll be discussing whatever's in the news. So let's first talk now about the last quarter of 2014 in economic news. The last quarter of 2014 actually had a circumstance in which the economy contracted 0.7%. Lots of people were saying that's terrible news, it's because of the winter, it's because of this, because of the Greeks, who knows. But actually having a bad economic report in one quarter is not that big a deal under any circumstance, and it actually works well for some people. It doesn't work well for people who have a fixed amount of money in the bank and live on their interest, because a bad fourth quarter means that the Federal Reserve Board increasing the interest rate is probably delayed a little further. And if you're living on interest, you want a higher interest rate. But for just about everybody else, it works pretty well. Here's why. If you want to buy a house, well, let's just say you're a normal consumer in the economy, it's probably going to be pretty good for you overall, because that bad quarter, which dictates a delay in raising of interest rates, probably is good for the economy broadly, which means it's good for all of us. The reason it's good for the economy broadly is the two biggest industries in America which drive the economy, drive in one of those cases is an unintentional pun, is housing and automobiles. And almost everybody buys houses and cars with a loan. Very few people pay cash. So, except for those of us who buy used cars. But even if you buy a used house, you're going to probably have a mortgage. So, with that in mind, if the interest rates are increased later rather than sooner, you are going to be paying less money in your monthly house payment, which means there's more money available to buy other things, which is good for the economy, but it also means more people will be buying houses because the cost of the house, when you include the cost of borrowed money, is lower. It also means that people who are selling their houses have a broader market of buyers because more people can afford to pay for the house with a lower rate of interest than with a higher rate of interest. So that said, the bad fourth quarter is not terrible news, or at least it's not universally bad. Okay. We mentioned we're going to talk about Bernie in Manchester. Well, first let's talk about American history a little bit. In American history, there were two famous McCarthys, not counting Jenny. The first one was Joe McCarthy, who was a senator from Wisconsin, who basically started didn't start, but he exacerbated and continued, inflamed, if you will, the anti-communist fears among the American people. He said that there were communists in Eisenhower's cabinet, communists in Truman's cabinet, and would have said the same thing about Kennedy's cabinet, except by then he had been disgraced and had drunk himself to death. That was Joe McCarthy. And when you hear about McCarthyism, it's that brand of rabid anti-communism, rabid conservatism that you're hearing about. The other famous McCarthy was Gene McCarthy. Gene McCarthy was also a senator. He was a senator from Minnesota. And he was an early opponent of the Vietnam War, as a result of which, when more people began to oppose the Vietnam War, he became very popular. And in early 1968, he decided to do something which was radical for its time. He decided to challenge President Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. And in New Hampshire in 1968, McCarthy didn't win that primary, though a lot of people think he did. And I don't mean because of bad vote counts. I mean, people incorrectly remember that he won the primary. He did not. But he got about a third of the votes. And in those days, for a member of the president's party to run against him at all was unusual. But to run against him and get 30% of the votes was extremely unusual. And it was the beginning of the end for Johnson in terms of any possibility of running for renomination and re-election. He could have run. There are constitutional reasons he could have, even though he was in his second term. But he chose not to, and he made that announcement on March 31st of that year, largely but not entirely as a result of Gene McCarthy beating him, but almost beating him in New Hampshire, certainly embarrassing him in New Hampshire. Well, this year, of course, Hillary Clinton is the presumed frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, but she's not any longer the only candidate. There are at least two other candidates. There will be three at least. The first candidate to declare against her was Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, who ran as an independent socialist but caucuses with the Democrats and is referring to himself as a democratic socialist, which he is. Also, today or yesterday, Martin O'Malley, former governor of Maryland, announced for the nomination for the presidency, and it is expected that Lincoln Chafee, former governor and senator from Rhode Island, will be doing the same thing. In New Hampshire, don't be surprised if Bernie Sanders does at least as well as Gene McCarthy did in 1968. Bernie Sanders, first of all, is doing better in the polls, but also he comes from the state which is right next door to New Hampshire. And within the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, the voters tend to be more liberal than the general Democratic population of the country. So everybody's written off Bernie Sanders. Don't be surprised if he does really well there. On the other hand, he'll do terribly in South Carolina. But if he does well in New Hampshire, anything can happen. It's not likely he's going to beat Hillary Clinton or that anybody else will, but it's possible. And New Hampshire could make a big difference. So, for what it's worth, my opinion, there you have it. Something remarkable happened in Nebraska this week. The one House legislature, the unicameral legislature, if you will, voted to override their governor's veto of their earlier bill to eliminate the death penalty in Nebraska. So the legislature voted to eliminate the death penalty, and the governor vetoed it, and the legislature overrode his veto. They did it for two reasons. One is it's very hard to get the lethal injection drugs anymore, in part because of all the botched executions that have taken place in places like our state here of Arizona, the state of Oklahoma, Nebraska, I believe, as well. So you can't get, but I may be wrong on that, so you can't get the drugs. The governor tried before the legislature voted to override his veto, but he failed because the DEA won't allow the import. You can't get it from any U.S. manufacturer or pharmacy. The other reason is cost. Although death penalty advocates disagree, it is fairly clear in the studies that have been done that it costs more to house a prisoner, feed him, medicate him, clothe him for the rest of his life. Of course, the clothing is rather drab. But to do all that for the rest of someone's life than it is to attempt to execute him. Partly that's because of the appeals and the legal costs and all the rest of it. But it is very clear that imposing the death penalty is more expensive than imposing life without possibility of parole. The other thing, by the way, is that life without possibility of parole ends all the appeals and all of the fame that these nutcases try to get for themselves by appealing. We have somebody here whose name I won't mention, but she keeps going through all these court appearances because she loves the attention. In any event, they overrode the veto, and now the governor is trying to get a referendum on the ballot so that the people of Nebraska can go ahead and reimpose the death penalty. One has to ask why. No one's ever been able to prove that the death penalty is or is not a deterrent to more murders. My position is I'm opposed to the death penalty, so I'd like to be able to prove that it absolutely is not a deterrent. Can't do it, the numbers aren't there. They're also not there for proving that it is a deterrent. Advocates of the death penalty will say, well, it certainly deters the guy who committed the murder. That's not deterrence, that's incapacitation. Deterrence is when you're being executed deters me from doing something. But the numbers, as I say, aren't there in either direction. But if all you want is incapacitation, which you get by killing someone who's committed murder, you get that just as easily with life without parole. So there you go. But that's what's happening. That's what's occurred with the death penalty in Nebraska. We may be able to do just one 25-minute video today because we've covered those subjects and we've talked about what the plan is for next week. I do want to do one commercial before we talk about This Week in History. If you are either in Arizona or you have a piece of litigation happening in Arizona, divorce or civil lawsuit, whatever, you need a process server. We'd like to recommend Lighthouse Process Serving, which you can reach at 480-628-9786. Incidentally, if you like the program or have a comment liking or disliking us, you can let us know that if you wish by emailing us at tjbradio@gmail.com. And we'd be happy to hear from you even if you disagree with everything we said. But you wouldn't be silly enough to do that now, would you? Okay. May 31st in history. In 1889, this is really a weird coincidence. In late May of 1889, the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, is almost wiped out by heavy rain and flooding, along with a neglected dam, to cause one of the worst floods in history. More than 2,200 people died. And the weird thing about this is the same week which in 2015 has been causing rain and flooding. The week hasn't caused the rain, but the extreme rain has caused flooding in areas around Houston, including Wimberley, Texas. It's weird that the same thing should happen around the same time of year, or perhaps it isn't, for some reason that I don't know, meteorological reasons. Also, on May 31st, 1902, the treaty was signed which ended the war between England and the Dutch, which was known as the Boer War. This was over South Africa, and the Dutch won. The English were driven out of South Africa. Actually, most of them drove their own tanks, but you get the point. Also, we were talking about Joe McCarthy earlier. On this date, in 1957, playwright Arthur Miller, who later married Marilyn Monroe, was convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to name those people he knew of in the 30s and 40s who were supposedly communists. He refused to name them and refused to denounce them, and as a result was convicted of contempt of Congress. There were a lot of birthdays on this date, May 31st. Among them was Walt Whitman, the writer of Blades of Grass and Leaves of Grass, I beg your pardon, and Captain, My Captain, which was a poem about the death of Abraham Lincoln. This was also the birthday in 1894 of Fred Allen, who was a famous radio comedian and had a mythological and false feud with Jack Benny. He was also on a couple of quiz shows on TV, including What's My Line several times. That was in the 1950s. Also on this date, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. Peale was famous, by the way, for something peculiar. In 1950, I'm not sure if it was 52 or 56, he announced that he was in favor of Dwight Eisenhower as contrasted with Adlai Stevenson, who was running against Eisenhower and lost to him twice. When they asked Stevenson what he thought about Norman Vincent Peale coming out for Eisenhower, Stevenson said, "I find the Apostle Paul appealing and the Apostle Peale appalling." And I almost screwed that up. But anyway, that was Stevenson, not me. Also on this date in 1908, Don Amici was born. Don Amici played Alexander Graham Bell in the biographical movie about him. And he also was in Cocoon and Trading Places in more modern times. Amici, by the way, changed the spelling of his name to Amiche. In the original family name was Amici, which is Amici, and is Italian for friends, plural. So he had a family of friends. This is also the birthday of Clint Eastwood, who is undoubtedly walking around saying, "Go ahead, make my birthday." Okay, that was not an imitation, and it's a good thing because it would have been lousy. And in 1938, on this date, it was the birthday of Peter Yarrow. For those of you too young to remember or too old to know, Peter Yarrow was one-third of the singing group Peter, Paul, and Mary, which among other things did Puff the Magic Dragon. And it's also the birthday in 1939 of the English envoy and diplomat Terry Waite, who was captured and kidnapped himself. Also the birthday of Joe Namath, as well as that great American actress who was born in 1965. You all know who she is. When I say great American actress, it kind of gives it away. Any guesses on the 1965 birthday of that great American actress? I'm, of course, referring to Brooke Shields. Okay. And also, this week in history, I wanted to just speed along here and tell you that in June we're approaching June, of course. June 5th is the date normally given, though I normally remember it as June 4th. 1968, and I'll explain that, was the assassination, but not the death, of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was killed following the June 4th primary in California, which he won against Gene McCarthy, about whom we spoke earlier. I say I remember it as June 4th because in California, when he was killed, it was still June 4th. News media recorded it then and still referred to it as June 5th because it was after midnight and thus June 5th when he was shot. He died a couple of days later after they tried to, they performed surgery, but it was frankly a waste of everybody's time. He was shot in the brain by Sirhan Sirhan and possibly others. In a while we may have an author on who will talk about the joint Kennedy murders. We've had him as our guest on the previous blogs we did on Blog Talk Radio as well as Going Beyond Radio on our old shows. June 1st, tomorrow, is the birthday of a singer who wrote the lyrics to the song Exodus. This land is mine, God gave this lovely land to me. He was born in 1934, thus making him 81 years old tomorrow, I think, if I did the math right. Yes, because in 2005 he would have been 71. Yeah, he's 81 tomorrow. That singer who wrote those lyrics also was famous for the songs April Love and Love Letters in the Sand, and for anyone even moderately old enough to now know that, that of course is Pat Boone. It was also the birthday of the late Andy Griffith. I mention him because the pilot episode of the Andy Griffith Show was actually part of the Danny Thomas Show, in which Andy Griffith's character was the sheriff who wore a lot of hats. And since in my life I wore a lot of hats, I feel a kinship. Anyway, we're going to end the video now. We ask you to join us next week. As said, if you enjoyed it, tell a friend. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know. Thanks very much for watching. And again, you can see our other programs by looking up the Jeff Bushman Experience. Thank you, and good night, everybody.